So hello everyone again. I thought it might be useful to go through a little bit some of the getting started with JavaScript and jQuery bits. I thought it might be useful to do these together, some of these exercises, and just basically go through this to make sure if anybody has any sort of problems or they're really stuck on any of the that first section, then you can take a look at this video and see what I'm talking about, maybe make a bit more sense. So let's first of all take a look at this quick exercise. What I wanted you to do was to copy and paste the HTML that I provided into your page. Oh, hold on. There we go. And so if we take a look at what that does, that gives us a paragraph here, sitting here. And then if we copy and paste the JavaScript as well up. I don't know why it's set to formatting 2 spaces. There we go. Make it look slightly neater. Okay. Then what we should see is actually what happens is when the page loads, very briefly we see the paragraph, and then immediately that the JavaScript loads, it disappears. And the JavaScript will always load a little bit after the page load, okay, because of this this function which we use here, which is document ready. This is a sort of standard way of loading jQuery functions into a page. The reason we do it is because if you start to run your JavaScript or your jQuery before your whole page is loaded and all the images and whatever, you sometimes have some sort of strange visual effects that happen. For example, you might use an element. jQuery might need to calculate the width or the length of an element before the image inside it has loaded, so it'll start the calculation, then the element will get bigger because the image will load, and then the rest of the calculation will happen, so you have some weird side effects. So what we usually do is we wrap everything that we're doing in the page, all of the functions, everything that we're doing with JavaScript, we wrap it in what we call an event handler, which says basically look at the document, and when the document fires off the event, which was called ready, run the following function. Okay, this is something that's pre-built into jQuery, so you can't just use any event name here. You have to use the functions that jQuery provides, but ready is one of those, which hooks everything into the ready event on the document. So document loads, fires the ready event, and then jQuery says, okay, do everything else that I've put in here then, which in our case is just one line, which takes anything labeled with a class myp and hides it. So as you can see, the effect of that is as I load the page, very quickly, almost instantaneously, but not quite, the paragraph disappears. Okay, so that maybe makes that a little bit clearer as to what's happening here. Then we have, then I said take a look at that and see what you can do with the CSS jQuery method, which we did see briefly above in one of the examples. What I can do is show you some of the things you can do with the CSS method. So basically, the CSS method, it takes 2 parameters. The first is a string, which is the name of the method you want to use, and then the second is the parameter of the CSS property, is the value of the CSS property you want to set. So for example, imagine that we want to set the color of an element. So in CSS we would write color blue like this. Okay, and so in JavaScript, instead of that we write .css to call that function, and then the first parameter is color and the second parameter is blue, and that could also be a hexadecimal value or an RGBA value or whatever. And as you can see, the paragraph loads and becomes blue. We can do lots of other stuff with this. You can change all the CSS properties basically using this method. We can add margin. We can add padding. Okay, any of that. Doing it in this way, i.e. loading the, sorry, I'm just going to make it a bit bigger, it's probably easier for you to see. Doing it this way, i.e. loading the padding just having a simple function which literally just adds padding obviously is not, in practical use, not really what you tend to do. We don't usually use JavaScript in this way. What we do instead is, because we're talking about adding interactivity to our page, often we add, instead of just doing this randomly at any point, we add it to an event. So the event might be clicking on a button adds padding to the top of the paragraph, or pressing enter on a form will change the color of the form fields if they are not valid text, right? That kind of thing. So we tend to do that sort of manipulation after an event happens, as opposed to doing it immediately that the page loads. But this is just to demonstrate that anything that you put inside here happens immediately that the page loads. So if we take a look next at the next section, I mentioned that there are other events. So let's, for example, use this here with the button that we have that currently does nothing, and we'll do that instead of the paragraph turning blue immediately that the page loads, what we'll do is we'll have it so the paragraph turns blue when I click on the button. It works in the same way. So it works in the same way as this function here, the document.ready, except that instead of putting the document in the jQuery here, we put the name of the we put the selector to select the element that we want. So our button has the ID my button. So because it's CSS selector style, I'm selecting it with a hash and then my button, and then I just use the event handler click, and then the syntax is exactly the same as above. So click works the same way as ready. When the ready event is fired on this, we do everything inside, and then here, when the click event is fired on this, we do everything inside. Again, because, as I said with JavaScript, we need to put everything inside the ready handler on the page. Even the click event handler has to go inside the ready handler on the page to be fired at the correct time. So here we select my button, and on click, we will do the same thing as before. So we select the P and we set the CSS, and instead of setting it to padding top, as I said, we will set it to color blue. So when I load the page, nothing happens. Then when I click the button, the paragraph turns blue. Okay, so this is how event handler works. Handlers work in JavaScript. This click event handler is very commonly used, but there are others as well, as I mentioned in the article. There's the on change, on submit, and on scroll. So these have equivalent jQuery functions: change, submit, and scroll. And you can use, for example, change happens anytime an input or a select field is changed, which is quite useful for forms. For example, if people are filling out forms and you want the form to validate the input immediately to check that they've entered the correct, I don't know, that it's an email address, actually is an email address. As soon as the input detects the change, it will fire some kind of validation in JavaScript, which then pops up an error if the email address is incorrect, for example. Submit is fired when a form is submitted, so that's really useful for overriding or for handling the submit of a form. So when somebody clicks the submit button for doing some stuff in JavaScript before we actually send the form for submission. And so these jQuery functions are provided like little shortcuts instead of using the onChange event every time. Here I put the example here, which I don't know if we necessarily need to do, because all I did here is I hooked in the click event onto the paragraph, which means that when you click on the paragraph, you have this alert box pop up. It's not really very realistic, but I can show you what it does, which is going to be the same thing. That when I click on the paragraph, this alert box will pop up and say, "Don't click me." Okay, so click on the paragraph. Don't click me pops up. If I click elsewhere in the page, obviously nothing happens. So the click event is attached to the paragraph. Notice that there's no little pointer hand, so this hasn't actually added a link to the paragraph. There's no link over here. It's just literally when you click on it, the browser is reacting with that JavaScript that we put in there. Okay, so hopefully that makes those few bits a little bit about how event handlers work a little bit clearer. if maybe the only other thing that would be useful to understand maybe is really exactly what we're doing, each part here, what we're doing. Basically, I didn't mention it before, but this dollar and the jQuery keyword are equivalent. They're both the same. You can use either of them. This is just a shorter way of writing out jQuery in full. Okay. Then we're selecting the paragraph with the dot for a class in CSS, and then the myp, which is the class we gave to this paragraph up here. Okay, followed by click, so they're using the click handler in JavaScript with the shortcut through jQuery using just saying click, and then within the click is just a function. So we did see this before. Maybe this syntax that we see here is a little bit confusing, but it's actually easy if you sort of break it down a bit. So to start with, this jQuery is a function, okay? jQuery is a function, a global function that returns an object that we can manipulate, and it takes one parameter, which is this selector. And so what we do is we replace the jQuery with the dollar to make it a bit quicker to write, and then we put the CSS selector in here inside. Then we have click, which again is just a function like we saw before. It's a function that is stored within the jQuery returned object. That's why we use the dot notation. We haven't seen that yet, but in JavaScript, dot indicates that there's a something within something else. So it's the jQuery object, and then it has a click function inside it. That's all stuff that's provided by the jQuery library, which is not really necessary for you to understand. You just need to know that that's how it works. So we call the jQuery the function on an element in the DOM somewhere on some class or something which returns some objects, and then we use the click, and click applies that the function that we give it to all the elements in that series, in that list. So here we select everything which is labeled as myp. We click on we use the click function, and then jQuery is waiting for us to provide it with a function inside the brackets. Now, maybe the way to explain this notation is to show you the alternative way of doing it, which would be to declare a full function, right? So we've seen this before. We saw this in the previous section. How we declare a function? We declare the function. The function is called pop_alert, and then we put the instructions inside of what we want it to do, and what we want it to do is this. Okay. Function is pop_alert, and what happens when we call pop_alert is that we have this alert pop up that says don't click me. And just to demonstrate that it really does work, okay, I'll call the function here, and we'll refresh the page, and I'll comment out this stuff, and we'll refresh the page and see what happens. And I'll just to demonstrate that immediately we have the thing pop up say don't click me, because it's being fired immediately the page loads, this function. We don't want to fire it immediately the page loads. We want to fire it when we click. So the way of doing this without this interesting sort of weird notation here is to literally define the function at the top, and then pop the name of the function into the jQuery handler. Okay, so what this does is it means that when you do click, by default click wants a function inside its brackets. That's what the parameter is. And so we say, okay, when I do click on this paragraph, do this function here, and I'm just passing it like the name of it like it was a variable. What will happen there is exactly what we said should happen. Let's hope this works. And that when I click on the paragraph, don't click me pops up. Okay, so all that's happening here is when I click on the paragraph, it's running this function, because that's the function I passed through the click handler. However, in JavaScript there's this neat feature called anonymous functions. So that if you want to think about this function maybe as a named function, because we've given it a name here, the function above this one and the one that we had in our second example is what we called an anonymous function, which is to say we did not give it a name. We just called a function, and then we just used the brackets to indicate the function is coming, but there's no name here. So all that means is that this function is not going to be stored somewhere in memory. It's not reusable. We can't call it a second time around somewhere else, okay? But it is exactly the same as this keyword here, pop_alert, referring to this function. It's just that this one is anonymous in that it doesn't have a name. and it's as if we kind of took this whole thing and we shoved it inside the brackets here. Do you see that this is actually, if I write this out without any spaces or returns, it's literally the same thing as this. It's just I haven't put the spaces in. So all I do with here is I hit a space, and then I end up with a new line, which allows me then to put my instructions inside the anonymous function here. But it's literally the same as if we wrote a function with a name with those instructions in and then passed the name through it. JavaScript also allows us to do these anonymous functions, which make our code a little sometimes easier to read or a bit more concise, which means we don't have to bother about naming every single function if we know we're not going to be reusing it elsewhere. So what the click handler takes a function, either a named function or an anonymous function, and then it executes that when we do the event. So in this case, when we click. Okay, so hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. And we can always talk about anything we've seen here in the live sessions, okay, online. So thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the course.